we can enjoy it for days and months and years to come. So the recording has now started. So again, thank you very much for joining us. A warm welcome, and we hope that you're all safe and healthy wherever you're joining us from. As I said, I am a core member of the Centre for Development Impact, and so by way of introduction, for those of you who perhaps aren't so familiar with our work, the Centre for Development Impact is a collaboration between the Institute of Development Studies in Brighton, and I am normally based in Brighton, although I'm currently surfing the COVID waves here in my home in Greece. And we collaborate with ITAD, which is a monitoring and evaluation provider headquartered in Brighton, and the University of East Anglia. So the three partners together make up the Centre for Development Impact. Since 2014, we have been reflecting together on impact evaluation methodologies. In particular, we've been interested in methods that can handle the complexity of large multi-scalar and multi-partner development programs. So some of our themes of work currently, or work that we're currently particularly interested in, includes contribution analysis. And Hilton, who's the director of CDI at IDS, and I convene a 5-day professional development course on contribution analysis for impact evaluation. We're also interested in realist evaluation, participatory methodologies, a particular focus of mine, and how we evaluate the impact of research, and in particular large, complex research for development programs. On our website, you'll find a series of practice papers, and so that the way we'll run this, when we get to the Q&A session, we'd ask that you please put your question in the chat on Teams. So I'll then come to you and ask you to unmute to ask your question. And when you do that, you can tell us who you are, so that it's not just myself speaking, but we know who else is in the room, so to speak. And we have an hour and a half in total for the session. So if some of you are able to stay on past the hour, that's great. It means we might be able to have a bit more of a discussion. Right, so with that all said, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our speaker for today, who is Tom Aston. And he's going to be sharing generously with us today his extremely rich experience with process tracing evaluations. And he'll be linking this and reflecting on it in relationship to realist evaluation. And I hope taking us on quite a deep dive into the territory of causal mechanisms, which is sort of a space that many of us have been swimming in lately. I'm sure many of you already know Tom's work over the years, and in particular, his recent absolutely fabulous blog series on method bricolage and his very, very clever use of metaphors, which was one of the reasons we were very excited when he agreed to come and speak with us today. Tom is an independent consultant, and he specializes in theory-based and participatory evaluation methods. He's worked with a number of international organizations, including, I think, about a decade or so with CARE, but also with World Vision, Oxfam, the World Bank, and the Overseas Development Institute. So with all of that, Tom brings a very rich experience from the trenches, which he's going to share with us today on process tracing. So Tom, the floor is yours. And just to remind everybody, if we could please keep ourselves on mute until I come to you so that you can ask your question. Tom.
Thanks so much. Happy to see a lot of faces and names I recognize, so that's really great to see, and thanks so much for the invitation as well. and also for accepting the name of the presentation. I didn't think I'd get away with the name of the presentation, but hopefully that's drawn a few people in. As Maureen was saying, I'm just through some of my thinking recently on combining or trying to combine different theory-based methods, and my emphasis has most recently been on process tracing, but I take a pretty open view of how different methods can fit together. So I'll draw attention to a few other methods as well that I think either that are participatory methods or that are sort of pure theory-based methods. I believe that there's no one method that's right for everything, and I think we can do a great deal more by combining bits of different methods for slightly different purposes. But what I'm going to try and do today is focus on primarily process tracing, but looking at how that can interact in some way with realist evaluation. And so that's where I'm gonna start. There's a helpful background here as well. I think this is a good moment to talk about it. There was a recent set of articles in New Directions in Evaluation, which look specifically at causal mechanisms. So I've been looking at how those have been presented and trying to reconcile them with my own practice. I'm going to try and share my screen, so please let me know if you can see it or not. And I'll try and talk for about 30 minutes or so, and then we can open it up for questions. Let's see if I can move that. There we go. Is it coming?
That's great, Tom. We can see it.
Great. So I'm going to focus, as I said, on process tracing and realist evaluation, but I'm going to start with very briefly what is theory-based evaluation. It's a lot of you on the call will already know this. It's essentially using theories of change, and theories of change are largely about how good your logic is rather than comparisons that you might make. And theories of change are also very much focused on unpacking what we call causal mechanisms. It's more about explaining how and why something happened than it is just about saying what happened. So you often have statements like, if A and B, then C because D. And so really what you're trying to do is explain that logic of how those things fit together to produce a particular change. So I'm going to start with what are mechanisms, which is probably one of the most difficult things that you can really discuss in this field. But it's at the heart of a lot of what theory-based evaluation brings to the wider evaluation field and how it potentially adds value. It's worth starting by saying there are very, very many different definitions of mechanisms across the social sciences, and they vary quite a lot in some of what they try and emphasize. But there are certain commonalities, which you can see on the right-hand side from a few definitions, which essentially we're looking, hopefully, at frequently occurring and easily recognizable causal patterns. What makes something causal is often a matter of dispute, but essentially we're looking at particular patterns. I've got two definitions there, one sort of from realist evaluation and another from process tracing. And you can see that the Pawson and Tilley from realist evaluation is looking at these regular patterns of social behavior, whereas process tracing is generally referring to causally linked sequences of events. So that's worth bearing in mind as I walk through, just in terms of what sort of the overall thrust or emphasis is. And you can see on the left-hand side a graphic I've taken from that journal article, the series of journal articles I mentioned, which I think also offers us a useful frame for how slightly different theory-based methods are trying to do slightly different things. And so you can see that we're not looking at experiments and what's referred to there as variance-based methods, such as randomized controlled trials. We're looking at what are referred to as case-based methods. So theory-based methods are generally forms of case-based methods. But you can see that the emphasis, or the type as it's put here, is potentially slightly different. And so whereas process tracing, contribution analysis and others, the authors argue, is looking at a form of process mechanism, realist evaluation is looking at what they refer to as a behavioral mechanism, so more about social behavior. I'll explain why that's important in a few seconds. So I'm going to go one level in and just very briefly sketch out some of the key points for you to take away about these two methods. Of course, it takes many, many days to understand these methods in full, but I know that there are a number of people on the call who already use these methods, so I'm trying to pitch this to get at the nub of some of the value added, but I'm not going to go into enormous detail about all the many features and all the many steps in the methods. But what I want to do is just bring out a couple of key points, salient points, make comparisons, and actually use these types of methods together. And I'll then a bit later give you a few examples of this in practice. So my screen appears to be frozen. I'm not sure why. There you go. It's just a bit slow. So for realist evaluation, the way that mechanisms are described most commonly, but not always, are about actors reasoning in response to resources. That's the famous phrase. What that really means is that you're looking really primarily at why it is a particular actor decided to take a certain action. So you're looking really at sort of an internal psychological process. You're looking at why it is an actor decided to respond to particular resources or opportunities that were provided by a program. And that piece about reasoning, or the motivational aspect, is really the main thrust here. And I think it's where realist evaluation helps us. It's not the only method, of course, to do this. Other people will be using things like the COM-B model, which is about capacity, opportunity, and motivation. You'll notice quite a lot of similarities there, insofar as the resources could well be capacities and opportunities that are provided, and the reasoning is very much like somebody's motivation, or what here is referred to as the preferences, norms, collectivist beliefs, and reasoning. It turns out that actually quite a lot of realist evaluation doesn't actually use this particular definition. A recent study found that about published articles actually use this definition, but I think it's the best one to use because it has that focus on the why. And that's something that I think lots of different theory-based methods really do need to focus on, because that's key to a part of our explanation. For process tracing, you've got a slightly different emphasis. You've got a slightly different concoction of words here, but the thrust here is really looking at a process and a sequence of events and explaining how those events are linked together. Another definition that's relatively commonly used is essentially looking at actors and the activities that they perform. So these actors produce particular changes. What's missing in that definition, however, is that motivational piece. It's often implicit in process tracing, which I'll come back to a bit later, but it's not always explained in detail. And that, as a result, means that some process tracing can be quite superficial and quite shallow, but it doesn't need to be, as I'll explain in a few minutes. But what realist evaluation brings to process tracing, or can bring to process tracing, is that additional focus on the reasoning or the motivational piece that people have. So that's a brief comparison of some of the thrust of the two and how they look at mechanisms. Lots of difficult language, but relatively straightforward components behind that complicated language. Another way of looking at this which Mel Punton brought out in one of the previous seminars, was about different levels of abstraction. Again, you could talk about this for hours, but I did notice when she was explaining how it was they'd employed realist evaluation, that even in her definition, in fact, there's actually quite a lot of combination going on between realist evaluation and process tracing. Part of the reason for that probably is because Mel and others also use process tracing. But what sort of came out for me really is that realist evaluation is looking at slightly different levels to process tracing. So on one hand, you're looking at the most granular, the most basic level of an individual actor's reasoning, why it was a particular actor decided to do something. And then you abstract upwards, if you like, for how certain actors in a particular context will tend to act. And so you're spanning essentially two different levels, but you can add value from the method at one at the most basic level, and one in terms of how you can potentially generalize your findings in an evaluation. Process tracing, on the other hand, is very much based around linking particular decisions, actions, and events. And so it's going from an individual actor's decision and the action that they actually took, and explaining how that features in a particular set of events, which could be with various actors, for example. So in fact, you can look at these methods at doing slightly different things at slightly different levels. This matters because you have to focus your attention. You can't look at everything, and therefore you can zoom in and zoom out at particular features. In contribution analysis, you also sometimes look at nested theories of change, for example, which I'll come back to. And that also does something similar with slightly different levels of analysis, if you like. So what this means, I think, at least for me, theoretically, is that you get certain snapshots of behavior in realist evaluation. And so you can see on the left-hand side, which comes from a realist synthesis around accountability and education, you can see the grey boxes, which are the mechanisms that are referred to. And you can see it more or less as a logic model, and how you get the mechanism at different parts, but not all the way across your logic model here. And as a result, Schmidt, for example, refers to these as neuralgic spots. And I think what they probably mean there is that it's referring to moments of cognition, essentially. Why was it, for example, if you take carrots and sticks, or say naming and shaming, if you name and shame somebody, you have to demonstrate that you're calling them out, you're naming them, and that your intention is to shame them, and that somehow that person is responding to a personal sense of shame, right? So you get a particular moment where that person would be responding to that assumed sense of shame, and you're trying to demonstrate that. But that may only be one moment in a much longer process. And as a result, realist evaluation has somewhat struggled with time. And on the from, I think it's Justin Jagosz, trying to illustrate how it is realist evaluation can actually look at time in a more sophisticated light. But this is actually an area where process tracing has a strength. As I try and click through, because the main emphasis of process tracing, or one of the main emphases of process tracing, is looking at how events are linked. Here we go. So in process tracing, you're often looking at what we call causal chains, which, if you like, are steps in the process. And one key aspect of that, obviously, is the time sequence of events. Because if somebody changed their behavior before your event, your moment, your intervention, well, then clearly you didn't have an effect on that outcome. So one of the key things that you're looking at is to explain the multiple steps in a particular theory of change. And it's really important to show that there is a logical and temporal sequence, but you're also really trying to explain how it is that particular events are linked together. And therefore, you're looking not just at the events, but the relationship between those events. On the left-hand side, you can see a diagram which comes from a project I work with in Bangladesh called JATRA. And this is their causal mechanism, where you can see about 25, I think, steps with slightly different strands of intervention. So there are, I think, about 4 or 5 key bits which come together essentially. But it's, if you look at the red piece there, you can see very clearly that you've got a large number of steps in the process. And so we got the team to look at all of those steps in their intervention and how that then came to a critical moment where a particular decision was made. In this case, this was essentially looking at how it was that marginalized communities were influencing local budgets and making those budgets pro-poor. And so you can see lots of things converging in sort of the middle right of the diagram there, where that key moment took place. So this is something which process tracing is generally pretty good at. But as you can imagine, it takes quite a lot of effort and quite a lot of time to come up with all of these steps and to break it down to this level of detail. And that has certain trade-offs in the process. Okay, we're still going. So the next thing that I wanted just to touch on as to where these two methods can come together, or do come together, perhaps unknowingly, is around how you look at evidence. The other thing that process tracing is really designed for, or is good for, is appraising how good your evidence is for your particular hypothesis. So a theory of change is basically a hypothesis, and what process tracing is trying to encourage you to do is to look at how good your evidence is to support or undermine that particular hypothesis. I'm not going to talk about the tests in process tracing, but you can see a brief illustration on the right-hand side of the 4 tests that people use. Again, lots of language that not everyone will understand, but the nub of it really is you're looking mostly for the yellow box and the light green box. And in the yellow box, essentially, you're looking for evidence you would expect to find. And if you don't find it, you ask questions about why, because that potentially diminishes your confidence in a hypothesis. And in the light green box, you're essentially looking for evidence you hope to find and can help to confirm your hypothesis. Now, exactly what evidence fits in what box is a matter of debate. But one thing that I think comes out of this is that what you're looking for in that confirmatory evidence often is that piece of reasoning that you get from realist evaluation. Why is that? It's because, for example, when you interview somebody, you're not just looking to establish that they were in the room, so that they attended the event, but that event actually did something for their motivation, that it encouraged them to do something, that it changed their attitude, that it got them to think differently about something and to do something differently. And therefore, in that sense, you do often have to look at not just the how and the basic steps in the process, but also the why. And so looking into the motivational piece around reasoning is actually really helpful in terms of how you think about one of process tracing's tests. But there's another piece of convergence here, which is that in realist evaluation, you refer to things which are called nuggets of wisdom. I don't really know what these are, but the premise here is that even in really bad studies, you can have really, really great evidence. It's not about, and therefore, sometimes in a bad study, you might have really useful testimony that sheds light on that particular mechanism. It helps to explain how and why a particular thing happened. The way process tracing looks at this, and this is also common for certain other evaluation theory, is around something called probative value. Again, another buzzword term, but all this really means is whether or not the evidence you find helps positively or negatively for your hypothesis, whether it either increases or decreases your confidence that your hypothesis stands, essentially. And so that concept is really helpful in terms of saying, well, why is this a nugget and not dirt, right? Why does this particular evidence help confirm my hypothesis rather than refute my hypothesis. One extension of this, which I worked on in part, and so the Bangladesh evaluation that I mentioned previously did this, is using what's called Bayesian process tracing. And in the simplest sense, all this is trying to do is to say that you start with neither positive or negative confidence, and depending on what that new evidence is, you either update your confidence positively, it either helps your hypothesis, or you update your confidence negatively, it decreases your confidence in a particular hypothesis. So you're hunting for evidence that either helps to confirm your hypothesis or that would potentially cast doubt on your hypothesis. If you don't find evidence that casts doubt on your hypothesis, that helps, but it doesn't get you all the way. You're often also looking for evidence that helps show that there's what we refer to as a unique connection between your intervention and the particular outcome that you're looking at. So you can hopefully see that behind the language, there are potentially a large number of coincidences here, where both of these methods can actually help each other, rather than what I think has been happening to date, which is competing for territory. And I think this refers to quite a lot of other methods that a lot of you, I suspect, on the call could imagine fitting into this. So I'll just give a couple more examples just to expand a little further, and then we can go to questions. I hope you're all still with me. And so here are just 3 more examples of slightly different ways in which you can use process tracing. So similar to the Bangladesh example, I've got an example from Ghana, and that way of thinking about probative value and the evidence they had, it didn't just help them in their evaluation to say that they were making a difference and how they were making a difference. It actually helped them to design monitoring systems better, because what it meant was that the team in country, based in Accra, trained all of its partners in process tracing and looking at what is good and what is bad evidence. And as a result, what happened was all of their partners were gathering less but better evidence. And so it was good for the partners because it meant that they didn't have to do so much, but it was also good for the evaluating agency, which was CARE, and also for USAID, who said it was a good idea. And so focusing your attention on explaining those nuggets and bringing out whether or not evidence actually really helps your hypothesis or not can be helpful, not just for evaluation, but also for your monitoring. One other thing from another evaluation, which was a slight variation of this, where I used sort of realist thinking in a slightly more explicit way, was an evaluation in Cote d'Ivoire around cocoa value chains. And what the team were trying to show was that they had been able to get different actors to contribute money to build local infrastructure. And one of the things that they wanted to demonstrate was the building of a health centre. And interestingly, in the process of the evaluation, we were identifying what's good and what's bad evidence for their particular explanation. And we talked about video evidence potentially being helpful because it's difficult sometimes to disprove. Of course, nowadays you've got deep fake technology and all sorts of things where you can fake things. But in general, video evidence can be reasonably good. Interestingly, in realist evaluation as well, the main example that's given is around video cameras as well. So even there you can see potential crossover. But what it did was it showed the team essentially what it is that they should be looking for in terms of those nuggets. And I think it therefore offered a structure to help them. But what realist evaluation or thinking about reasoning also did, for me personally, was helping in interview evidence for me to think about how it was that people were explaining their connection to the intervention and their motivation. Because if we didn't have any indication of their motivation, then it didn't really help very much for the hypothesis. And therefore, thinking in terms of motivation and reasoning, or interest and incentives, to put it in political economy and language, can actually be really helpful in terms of saying whether or not and how a particular evidence can give you confirmatory evidence. One final example I'll finish with is showing how you can move process tracing around, in fact, in terms of those levels of abstraction. So I stole this from Marina and Giel, in fact, because the process we had actually is very much within a contribution analysis framework. And so we're proposing to have embedded theories of theories of change within a broader theory of change, where we can then go out and gather evidence and test the theory that we have using process tracing tests. So that's a sort of a segue to say, I'm certainly not the only person doing this. Many other people are doing similar things. But you can, I think, also find ways to fit process tracing within realist evaluation, but also fit process tracing within contribution analysis as well. So I'll leave it there. I think I'm more or less to time. I hope you've been able to follow, and hopefully I've got most of the key points across. But I'm curious to hear what people took away from this. Back to you, Marina.
Fantastic, Tom. Thank you so much. I mean, there's so much there, but you do a fantastic job of demystifying and sort of breaking down language, which can be really quite dense and difficult to engage with. So thank you for that. If you have questions, please do put them in the chat. There's a couple of comments by Rick. So I wondered if you wanted to, Rick, unmute and share some of your thoughts, and if you have a question with Tom.
Maybe a statement of appreciation. I just thought two things I liked. One was combining methods. There's so often an apparent competition between evaluation and method brands. It's really good to see some thinking about creative combinations of methods. I think we need a lot more of this. Secondly, I think this really clarified in my mind understanding the relationship between process tracing and its slightly more macro level perspective and realist evaluation and its more micro level perspective. So I found it very useful. So I think I'll just leave it at that point.
Great. Thanks a lot, Rick. Great. Terry Cannon, do you have a question you'd like to ask?
Yeah, thank you very much, Marina. Very interesting, Tom, and it's outside my area, but I would love to talk to you at another time to go into more depth. I'm looking at it from the other end. I'm not an evaluation specialist at all. I work mostly in disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, some of that, or quite a lot of that, in Bangladesh. So from that end, what I see there with both international NGOs and local NGOs or UN agencies is an almost complete lack of interest in impact. So, for example, I work with a very large international NGO, and one of the people who worked for that in Bangladesh actually became one of our students on an MA at IDS. And she said that they're just contract processors. They want to get the next contracts, they get the local NGOs to be their partner. And when it's done, they try, her phrase was, they try to burn money as quickly as possible. So they're using up the budget as quickly as possible so that they can get the next contract. Now that approach has been confirmed to me by another very large international NGO, mainly in the field of disasters and climate adaptation. So that's one problem, is that they're not even scared. They're not at all worried that somebody will come along and say you didn't do a very good job. And I've never yet seen an NGO report on activities they've done that is critical of what they've done or points out the negativities of what has actually happened. So that's from the practice end. Then we have Mansouri and Rao's book from 6 years ago, localizing development, which is a very detailed analysis of nearly 500 local development projects in which they found, contrary to the claims, that many of them have significant elite capture. Okay, so we've got evidence from both ends of the kind of chain, from a donor, and incidentally, that book, the director of the World Bank tried to suppress that book because it was so embarrassing to the World Bank, because it involved billions of dollars of spend. And then the third point, they are all linked up, but the third point is that evaluation is only of what was intended. So my work in Bangladesh on disaster risk and climate adaptation, the spend on these is from donors who are trying to achieve something which has a material outcome. They're intended to have a material outcome. It's not training, it's not changing how people think or whatever. And those are almost impossible for people who are landless or small farmers to engage in. And in coastal Bangladesh, around 80% of the households are completely landless or have tiny plots of land. In other words, they're not able to participate in any of these activities because they do not have the resources, the livelihoods which can fit into them. So it seems to me quite pointless to evaluate something where the actual goal of the activity is not actually representing what people need. The funding has not gone into supplying anything at all which will help people deal with disaster risk or climate change.
Lots of interesting points there. I can cover a few of them. I mean, the Bangladesh example is a really good one for you, I think, actually, because it does actually have really good evidence of participatory planning processes that do appear to work, and where, in fact, I think we did have pretty good evidence that there was significant influence. But what was probably more important than that we could prove one way or another that it made a difference, this was actually a World Bank funded project, as it turns out, was that it helped the team themselves to explain what parts of their intervention were working and how different bits of their intervention contributed to different outcomes. So one of the key tension points with the team was saying, not all of your activities lead to all of the results. So some of your activities, some of the things that you do lead to these particular results, and others we can't show exactly how they made a difference. And that was really hard for them, actually. But it didn't mean that what they were doing was a waste of time or that it was a failure necessarily, but it meant that not everything they did made a contribution to the things that they were evaluating. And you had to choose, what do you want to focus on, what matters most to you. We gave them free rein to say, what do you want to evaluate, rather than telling them this is what you should evaluate, right? Similarly, I think that the point you make around, I'll come back to the localizing development piece, which is an interesting book, around unintended and intended. There's nothing in this that tells you have to evaluate your intended effects. You can choose this if you want ex post and decide after the event, depending on whatever outcomes you had, these are the ones we want to evaluate. There are also other methods as well, which are very much geared towards that. So outcome harvesting, for example, doesn't necessarily pick your outcomes ahead of time. You describe what outcomes you have, and then you try and prove that you have those outcomes. And I can see Richard Smith was on the call, so he can probably comment on that, perhaps. So there's nothing forcing you to evaluate what your intended effects were. In fact, this helps you for unintended effects as well, because you, as I say, you have to make choices because this is resource intensive. To say these are the things that matter to us, or to a particular community, they say these are the things that matter to us. We want to evaluate these, as you would do in most significant change, for example. So there's nothing forcing you to do that. On the localizing development piece, this project was really designed around limiting elite capture, and it had all sorts of difficulties. It's probably the most complex intervention I've ever seen. It really took weeks to get my head round, to be honest with you, so I don't really have time to go into all the details, but they very much focused on participatory resource mapping, identifying where there were poorer parts of communities. They had an almost impeccable process of tracing who participated where, how, who made what demands to whom, whether those demands were resolved enormously onerous administratively. But as a result, what it meant was that we had really quite good evidence to show that these particular marginalized communities who we could show were marginalized from the resource mapping did in fact have some influence over those local budgets. Now, of course, there was still elite capture going on. And one of the key points, in fact, for the team, we did contribution tracing, which is a formalized form of process tracing with Bayesian updating, which essentially is process tracing tests and adding numbers which tell you how confident you are that you've contributed to a particular change. And one really key point of contention about the numbers was that in one key step, local authorities had a veto, right? So they had to come up with like 10 priorities, say, and 3 of the top priorities were from these marginalized communities. At the moment of decision, it was still up to, I think it was the Union Parashad chairman, they could have vetoed particular issues if they wanted to. So it's possible that having a more participatory process actually meant that decisions were made elsewhere as well, right? So it doesn't, the intervention didn't fully fix that, but what it did allow us to do was to show where those veto points were, where it was you had more or less control, and the bits of people's interventions that appeared to make a difference in that sense. But it also illustrated how difficult it actually is to ensure that marginalized communities can have a say and somebody listens to them and somebody does something as a result. So yeah, we're not getting around that, and that's certainly relevant for DRR and climate change in, I think, a very similar way. I think I've got all of those.
Great, excellent, Tom. I mean, a really fantastic explanation in terms of the rich learning one can get from using these approaches, no? And also the kind of combination with the participatory methods and choosing together where you focus, no? So the kind of who can be in that process can be relatively open. Great. So I'll come to Anna Haskins. Would you like to ask your question? Anna, are you there? Well, the question is, how do you choose the moments to deploy reasoning analysis if it appears, as it appears too time consuming to do it at every stage in the process? So essentially, yeah, it's quite involved. So how do you choose where to focus? I'm
not sure I really know the answer to that. I think likewise, Marina, you can probably give us as good an explanation as I can. I think it depends where you start, because often in realistic evaluation, you start by developing a series of mechanisms you expect, and then you therefore partly focus attention on trying to uncover and find evidence for those particular mechanisms. And so those often have sort of key moments in the process that you're looking to zoom in on. But you maybe don't need to zoom in on absolutely everything. If I were to go back to the Bangladesh example again, although it was important to establish that there was an unbroken chain between point A, point B, C, D, etc., not all of those events were as important as each other, right? It was important in terms of explaining the fidelity of the intervention and that, things happened as people said it happened. But if you really wanted to focus, you're not looking just to show that your intervention happened as you said it did, but that that somebody changed their mind or somebody important decided to do something. So to the right-hand side of the diagram, things became more important as you go sort of up the chain. That's where it matters in this case, where it would have mattered more that you could show that particular decision maker listened to that particular community. And so that was a key part where we needed to find evidence where it was that one of those decision makers knew about the process, that they had listened to some of the requests, demands that had been made, and that the outcome had actually happened. And so often that came from interviews, and that's again where realist evaluation very much focuses. I think it's a strength and a weakness of realist evaluation. I'll put out a blog on why I don't like realist interviews next week. One way this was described when I was trained in process tracing by Gavin, Stephen and Bryce was a case from Oxfam where everything came down to a key sort of moment with a particular decision maker who had recently resigned from their job. And so there was a campaign around universal health insurance in Ghana, I think about 10 years ago, more or less now. And they had lots of good evidence to show this was an Oxfam campaign with, I think, 500 or so other local organizations. And they were trying to show how their campaign had influenced the ministry to revise its methodology for estimating how many people benefited from the scheme, because they believed and showed that fewer people benefited from the scheme than statistics showed. Right? And the way that was revealed was largely through a closed door meeting supported by I think it was an email from somebody who had just left the ministry and therefore didn't have great incentives to just lie, as you might otherwise do, and revealed that against their better intentions, the Oxfam and the rest of the coalition, their campaign gave them a lot of trouble, made them really angry, got under their skin essentially. And so because it was behind closed doors and because they didn't really have an incentive to admit that somebody else forced them, if you like, to change their method, that's what was important. So if you hadn't had that interview, Gavin was telling me, you would have much, much worse evidence overall that the particular claim was true. So it really came down to one key point, one key interview with one key person. That wasn't the only evidence. But because it wasn't in his interest to reveal that information, because because it was embarrassing for the ministry, that's exactly why it had high probative value, essentially. And this is the flip side of it, if you interview, say, your partners or a local community who has an incentive to tell you what you want to hear, and you ask them a leading question, it's not very good evidence, right? Because they've got endless incentives because you're going to give them more money next year or something to tell you what you want to hear, whether it's true or not. If you ask somebody who doesn't have the same incentives to tell you what you want to hear, and ideally that hates you and resents you and everything else, it's much more likely to be good evidence if they tell you something that's counter to what appear to be their incentives, right? And so you could sample who you want to interview to look for that kind of information. You wouldn't just interview all your friends, for example, right? That's a bit of a waste of time because it doesn't tell you much more than you already know, right? That may be necessary, but it's certainly not sufficient to back up your claim.
Great. I mean, that's a fantastic example, no? And particularly about what you bring out, one of the strengths of process tracing. It's always been what I considered its biggest strength, which is really getting you to think about the quality of your evidence, no? And so combining the kind of where do I focus with exactly how am I going to unpack that piece of the puzzle, which links, I think, to Kjell, your question. So would you like to come in?
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, my question is a bit from the perspective of ex ante impact evaluation design, because your explanation of process tracing is very much exposed. You trace back a process and you know the outcome already. But often you are also in a situation that you need to plan for data collection to allow ex process tracing, and there is a problem which is is a reality. So the question is, how do you practically in practice resolve that? How do you build evidence gathering which you can use later on to ex post validate or verify processes? Where do you stop? Because there are so many processes and there are so many processes within processes, and you don't know in advance which will be relevant because you don't know what has happened. So how do you in practice resolve that ex ante planning of an impact evaluation where you want to apply those process tracing tools?
I think it's tricky in that you can use process tracing ex ante and ex post, right? So in certain forms of Bayesian process tracing, you're doing ex ante assessment of your level of confidence, and that helps plan your data collection. And so what you do in contribution tracing is you'll identify evidence for each key step in the process, and then you essentially set levels of confidence numerically for that. That can be potentially very time consuming and quite onerous, and it's not worth doing that for everything. Someone I think asked me this morning actually. So I certainly wouldn't do that for everything. But what it can give you, in a similar fashion to realistic evaluation, if you have a logic model and you say, here are 3 generally anticipated mechanisms. So let's say it's related to the naming and shaming example. Like you can imagine the sorts of things that would be illustrative of, right? Is it that exposure would happen? What would you therefore need to look for? How would you find it, etc. So you can plug that in at the beginning as well in your logic model or your theory of change when you start a project. And I've done that recently with that intention in mind, and I will see what I find. But I'm not going to throw all my resources at it immediately because I don't know, as you say, what's necessarily going to come off. But it does, I think, help potentially streamline some of the data collection of stuff that you would expect to be important or not, to give people antennae to know what to look for, even if you don't have to gather everything. So identifying lots of evidence doesn't mean you have to gather it all, right? You can always say, no, I'm not going to gather this because it's got low probative value. Similarly, for realist evaluation, you say, well, I'm not going to gather this because it's not related to my mechanism, right? Now, that's a problem because you can pre-cook too much. And there's lots of confirmation bias that comes with trying to fit into a mechanism in realist evaluation, I think. The same sort of risk to some degree would be true for process tracing, where you can one criticism is you can misidentify, and that's a problem. So I think it's the sort of thing at midline, it's worth focusing on little bits. You go, this was an important change. For example, you might have progress markers from outcome mapping, which give you some indication. You can write out outcome statements from outcome harvesting. You can then go and identify evidence from there, for example. I don't think there's a clear rule for how much is too much, but I tend to find that for most projects, when you get beyond about 30 indicators, it becomes too much. We also found for process tracing, for the type of mechanisms we were talking about, or similar forms of those, once you got beyond about 25 steps, it became pretty unmanageable to do. Depends what level of abstraction you're talking about, but generally speaking, 25 steps would mean you needed a couple of pieces of evidence for each. So 50 bits of evidence. How many people do you need to interview? How many records do you need to collect? So that can also, I think, help you. Likewise, there's no reason why you couldn't have nested theories of change where you have a general theory of change, you then break it down as you might do, and you focus on key elements. So I think you can start with a general theory of change, possibly look at mechanisms from realist evaluation. You can then zoom in on key aspects depending on what you think those things are supposed to mean to you. But all of these things are hugely resource intensive and time intensive. So you've got to be really, really careful where it is you really want to zoom in and where it matters. And I'd say zoom in where it is that you think a particular interviewee can raise or lower your confidence, right? They're a decisive person. If they say, I don't know who your intervention is, you fail your hoop test, it's a disaster, let's say, or the reverse. You know, somebody who you wouldn't expect to tell you did a great job tells you did a great job, and that is better than evidence from somebody else. So I think these are largely just critical thinking heuristics for me. You know, you've only got so much time, so where do you think it will make a difference? And whether you start with realist evaluation or contribution analysis or process tracing, I don't think it really matters. You can just see, I think, where each of them can add something to what it is you're trying to do at that particular moment with the resources you have. You know, go back to the design triangle from the Stern review, for instance, like what resources have I got? What do I actually want to answer? And that dictates, you know, what you should hopefully spend more time and effort on, I think.
Yeah, one comment on it, because what in my experience, but it depends, of course, in what type of project you work, contribution analysis with the steps could provide some sort of iterative process of defining what are the important areas where you concentrate your resources for process tracing or for realist evaluation on, because it also inherently has because it's iterative, you can change it, and you don't need to specify in advance, the one research question which you're going to answer.
One other point actually is, like, when do you flip from theory building to theory testing? Is kind of your question. When are you confident enough that it's worth trying to apply tests or to really go and gather evidence? I think that's another point as well, where if you're just trying to build theory, then you've got a slightly different focus to when you zoom in and say, I'm going to test this now, or I'm going to gather data around this. So yeah, I agree with you. I think I nearly, for the ladders of abstraction thing, I nearly did it for contribution analysis as well, but it got too messy, so I stopped. And I think you guys could do that better than me anyway. So I'll let you try that if you can. Great.
There's another. I mean, we're sort of circling around this question of how do you prioritize, and the fact that it could be it could be never ending, and Rick's suggesting 25 steps seems a lot. But I wonder if Steve wants to come in, because you have, I think, a similar question from a slightly maybe different angle. Steve?
Yeah, sure. Hi. Thanks, Tom. That was great.
Hey, Steve.
Hi. Yeah, I just wanted sort of to bring it to a point, to be a bit controversial. Would you say that basically every time you collect the next bit of data, you should be trying to maximize probative value? End of story.
I think it comes back to that same question. It depends how much you think you know. Yeah, I think probably yes. It's difficult for me to say otherwise. Start thinking like this, it's quite difficult to stop thinking like this, right? So I'm locked in, I think, to do that kind of informal, weighing up evidence in that light anyway. So I don't really know how to answer no to that. But at the same time, it is difficult to do, both in terms of critical thinking sometimes, but also in terms of finding a structure. So you don't have to do process tracing tests. You don't necessarily have to do all of them. But the basic logic of what does this do for my hypothesis is something that all of these methods are actually trying to do, whether or not they say they're trying to do it explicitly or not.
Yeah. So
it's the sort of a key takeaway of the generative logic anyway. So yeah, I have to say yes, but again, it comes back to depends how much time you've got to think about it and identify evidence. And we found also with the 25 steps thing as well, it was better front loading that analysis and then gathering less data than it was going out and seeing what you could find and probably potentially wasting quite a lot of time because you haven't really thought about it. So I think before you're going to gather a amount of data, it's definitely worth taking a bit of time to say what evidence and why and what will this do for whatever my theory is, however abstract or precise your theory is, I think.
Great. Yeah, cheers. Yeah, thanks. I could say a bit more, but other people too. Cheers.
Thanks, Steve. Louise, if you're still there, I think similar prioritization question, but from perhaps a slightly different positionality.
Yeah, hi Tom, thank you, that was great. I feel I've sort of really struggled with the COM-B and the CMOs, and that was, I think, the clearest presentation. And I was like, lots of light bulbs. I've got one sort of at my head, so just to prove the point. So I'm sort of, this is all great and really, really useful. And again, the prioritization question in terms of, so sort of two perspectives really. In terms of someone who manages monitoring, evaluation, and learning, specifically log frames, reporting, and that sort of how we can be generating the data through those processes, but then also the balance of really struggling with when we come to talk about impact with project reporting, we're not actually evaluating. We want to apply evaluative thinking. We want to be rigorous, but we're very, very limited. So just that's sort of that. But I think we've talked a lot about the prioritization, and I think you have sort of already answered that question. So just to take the conversation really in terms of thinking about the alternative hypotheses and thinking about what else is potentially driving those change, and how, in the context of, telling our story, we can also explore those alternative mechanisms, and then, sort of also countering that with the reality and the point, your previous response in terms of looking for the evidence you want, but then the reality as an evaluator that here's the list of people that we need you to interview, and go away and write it. You sort of do your interviews, and you sort of pick through the data and write your report. So sort of coming back to this very pragmatic, limited resources, limited access to data sources, trying to understand also bring in sort of some of the alternative explanations. Thank you.
That's helpful. Yes. There's a really good, I think it's about 5 or 6 pages paper by Jess Stark called the What Else Test. So for people that want that sort of quick, have a look at, that rival hypothesis thing, that's a really good place to start, I think. Similarly, in process tracing, what you're trying to do with a smoking gun test really is looking at those alternative mechanisms. Whether and how you do that is very much a political decision. So when this was in the paper that we wrote, comparing predictive evaluations, where we looked at whether or not, or to what degree we looked at alternative hypotheses and how much time and energy it took to do that. So similarly with the 25 steps or whatever, you would potentially look at rival hypotheses themselves with a number of steps. The teams doing this in a participatory way were not awfully keen in explicitly looking at alternative hypotheses and gathering data around alternative hypotheses. Why? Well, risk of being wrong, possibly, time, other things. So I think similarly, when you're saying, how much do I really want to look at, you're also looking at how much would I need to gather to invalidate my hypothesis too. Now you do that by proxy of a smoking gun test anyway, to some degree. So you don't absolutely necessarily have to go and do that in depth at length, but it can be quite helpful. I had a colleague called Bernardo, for example, who did an evaluation for IAED, and they looked at about 5, I think, alternative hypotheses. And so I'd love to do a few, but it's very difficult to do more than 1 or 2 because of time and resources. But similarly, for your own intervention, because, if you like, the probative value of that, how unique the connection is, so the smoking gun piece, you should really be focusing your attention on asking that question, which is about the rival hypotheses and what are the threats to your particular hypothesis anyway. Whether you can prove that your intervention happened as you said it did is kind of neither here nor there. I mean, it's important, it's necessary, but it doesn't get you very far. And this is also criticism that I think a lot of people have had of process tracing, where you go, well, this is just surface, it's just events, it's just description or whatever. And it can be if you're just looking at whether or not, hoop tests, whether or not your activities happen as you said you did. So if you consider you've got a meeting and somebody attended, so you've got an attendance sheet and you can prove that they were there, well, great, but so what, right? And so I think it comes to that where you need to show that your key events, whatever they might be in the in your project, more or less happen as you said you did, because you need to, as an evaluator, check that there's certain fidelity and what have you. But really, I think you should be focusing your inquiry in where it is you could be wrong, and thinking about where it is that somebody else could have got there first. So sort of the what else piece, going, if it's this for advocacy, for example, like, well, okay, your campaign, but who else might have got somebody to change their mind before you got to before you got to deliver your message? Or were you the last person to speak to somebody? Was that the decisive moment? So you are, I think, thinking, or trying, or should be thinking about what else is probably the primary question you're looking for, because it's looking at what are the threats to your hypothesis, really. And again, that's why I think this goes beyond process tracing. It's something that all these methods and lots of research is trying to do anyway. It's just making it a little bit more explicit than you otherwise would do, I think. So that's my take on it.
Great. I think the IID evaluation you mentioned, I think was that not an internally commissioned evaluation?
Yes, I think so.
In terms of really wanting to dig in and learn for themselves around how their programs were or weren't working. And so the incentive, I guess, being there to look at rival explanations in a way that often isn't.
Yes, and they were themselves very keen on the particular method too.
And they were also investing in the method, exactly.
They were also investing in the method, and I think that made a difference. Yeah, and that's also why they were so keen to look at. I think they were probably so confident with what they had done because they already knew what they were looking for, and they knew the method probably, that they were happy bringing in Bernardo to do that. But we've had others where there's been slightly more agnosticism towards it. I had a colleague I helped called Alex who did one in with World Vision Canada, another campaign, and there was less appetite for alternative explanations, but there was still enough going on, and we were able to push hard enough to say this matters. And when they saw, I think what happened was when they saw that they could find that they actually really did have evidence that they could back up their hypothesis, they were less worried about it. But initially, when we started saying, I'm not sure what you're saying holds, and they started sort of getting itchy feet, and we're like, well, I don't really want to, do we really want to spend our time looking at these other things? Because they were already really confident that they made a really big difference, but they hadn't articulated it particularly clearly why and how it was that they had done so. But sort of by the time they got halfway through the evaluation, they were, I think, more confident that, oh yes, this adds some value, this can be helpful, because it can show us not only that we were effective, but that we were more effective than, I think it was like the Malala Fund or something like that. It was an education campaign. That doesn't mean that Malala and others didn't do something important. It just meant that what they did was also really important in and of itself, and you could show that there was a connection, because you're not necessarily, it's not really possible to rule out all other explanations. Lots of other things are also explanations, and it's pretty silly to suggest that your intervention is the only thing that makes the difference. There was a good webinar from ODI last week where I think it was Toby Lowe said, I forget what the sector was, but there was like 100 factors around, what was it, something like homelessness or something like that. And there was a project, and the project accounted for 4 factors of the 108 or so factors. So don't get ahead of yourselves. Anything that's complex, you're only a minor part of it. And I think what this also helps you to do is to think about where it was you made the difference, not just, you made a difference to everything, because you didn't. You made a difference to certain bits possibly, and very significantly, but not to lots of things. And I think that we need to get comfortable with that, to be honest with you. But what it does mean is the politics of the evaluation itself is more difficult, because you have to explain to your client or your colleague that maybe it's not as good as you think it is, or maybe what you've sold a donor isn't quite true, or maybe this is wonderful, but that's not so great. And so for the Cote d'Ivoire one, for example, we were really the example I gave, that was the main thrust of the intervention. That was what was really good about the intervention. And I knew about that from years previous. They were good at community planning. Another thing which was sort of, they wanted also to look at village savings and loans associations and how they built voice and things like that. And we didn't find that at all. And I suspected that we weren't going to find that, because I'd heard the tall tales about village savings and loans associations for years, and I and another colleague of mine were not that convinced, but they wanted to do it, and we found not very good evidence that it had made a difference that they wished for. So it was helpful in that respect that they forced us to evaluate something we didn't really want to evaluate because it wasn't really worth evaluating. But in doing so, it meant that they had to think rather harder about the connections that they'd sold publicly about, you know, what village saving does. And we found pretty much that, you know, village saving helps village saving. It doesn't necessarily help anything else unless you really, really make sure that the other things are designed that way. It can make a difference in the same way that any platform, any meeting, any space offers potential to bring people together to do stuff. But it depends what you want to do in that meeting as to whether or not it's going to make the kind of difference you want, I think. But it's tricky. It's tricky.
Sure is tricky. Okay, so I'm just thinking if Melanie or Mel, if you're still there, I think your question might bring us to, I think, what many people have appreciated, Tom, from this discussion and listening to you speak, is that your insights, and this is in your blog series, this idea of bricolage, no, and this idea of bringing methods together, combining, complementing, and so, yeah, what does it take to do that, right? So obviously the level of kind of skill and nuanced understanding you have of the methods comes through, and that sort of critical thinking you were talking about before, which is necessary to bring them together. So Mel, I don't know, are you still there? Did you want to come in with your question? All right, she may not be there. So basically what she says, an argument is for evaluators to gain experience in as many approaches as possible, as this helps give you the tools and mindsets needed to cross-fertilize. So I wonder if you might bounce off that a little bit with kind of your experience over the years of how you've built the skills and the mindset to do this bricolage.
I think probably the main thing was just assuming that no one has all the answers, you know, and a curiosity to read lots and criticize people, really. You know, so I think a curiosity is key. You know, being critical is also important. I think it also probably takes a bit of courage as well, because I've noticed in certain communities that there's certain hegemonies that come out, and it's very difficult to question certain people. And I think probably because I don't have very much respect for that, I'm slightly cavalier about it. But I don't think there's any reason why other people can't. And I think probably more important to say, Mel included, lots of people are doing this. They're just not talking about it. So Mel's example in her paper, I mean, the definition they have of mechanism, for me, is a mixture of realist mechanism and process tracing mechanism. The very words are quite clearly a collage of both Pawson and Tilley and Beach and Pedersen, I think. But maybe that's just my reading of it. You know, so I think people are doing this. I think the first thing is to get people talking about it, and show where it is that people are doing that. So like I can see, I think probably still there, Richard's on the call, combining outcome harvesting with process tracing. Process tracing was new to him, but it was a request from Oxfam, and therefore he used what he knew and combined something, and you learn something new. Similarly, I was asked to do a realist evaluation for World Vision, and that's helped deepen my understanding or see some of these combinations. So you can, you know, how you harness those opportunities. But I think probably just be curious, assume that nobody has all the answers, and pick and mix the bits that you like, and discard anything that you neither understand or appreciate. And I think what the blog series was really about was just picking out one or two things I liked about methods I used. And it wasn't really very much more than that. Other people may take away slightly different things from different methods. So I personally find for realist evaluation that the micro level is more useful than the mid level, because I think there are more problems with confirmation bias around the middle level. It's too easy, I think, in some respects to to say, I've identified a mechanism and I'm going to find evidence to fit it, right? Good evaluators can do that, and obviously do. But if you're not a very good interviewer, or you're not a particularly good evaluator, then it's difficult. So all of these methods have sometimes quite serious weaknesses as well. So I think bear that in mind too. But yeah, I think curiosity, being critical, and also just, as I said, getting people on this call to start acknowledging, admitting when it is they're collaging, bricolaging, combining, and make it into more of a conversation.
Great. Well, in that spirit, we still have people on the call. I don't know if Rich or Mikkel or Rick, who had suggestions in the chat along these lines, if anybody wanted to jump in now with your own experiences or thoughts about how we keep this conversation going about bricolage and about kind of, as Rick suggests, breaking down the brands into components that we can put together and use.
I would just, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. I just like to make a comment of appreciation, because I've been trying to get my head around how we have so different approaches to similar questions in different professional fields. I used to work in the international development aid, then I worked in mental health services, and now in evaluation. And it's always seemed to me that it was more of tradition and coincidence than in development aid. We spoke of logic models, program theory, and contribution analysis. In political science, when at university, we spoke of process tracing. Yep. And in evaluation, we speak of mechanisms. We do need to break down some of the barriers, because sometimes then it's more because of inertia, in my opinion, that we continue on the paths in the literature from when we were trained. And we need to get back to evaluation as a form of critical thinking, as opposed to saying, no, I use this bulletproof method, so my conclusions are automatically valid. So I just want to say that the marriage between the three that you're suggesting is very much needed and appreciated. I don't know if I agree with you about your critique of the realist interview and confirmation bias. Maybe. I'll look forward to your blog and we can
next week
discussing. Thank you.
That's helpful. Yeah, I agree with you strongly. I think one other thing I've learned, I mean, I knew this anyway, I suppose, like, obviously people learn things from different methods. People have different sets of expertise. But as you say, behind a lot of this, in particular around theory-based methods, it's about logic and critical thinking, or it's about evaluative thinking, which is a form of critical thinking. And lots of people who are not evaluation specialists are good at critical thinking. Some of the people who are really, really good in these evaluations, we deliberately got teams themselves to gather the data, right? So that they could learn what data mattered and what data didn't matter. And many of the better people were not evaluation people at all. They were, district managers or something. And they just had, an inquisitive mind or, really good critical lens or whatever it was. And they were, some of them were brilliant. But even people who didn't naturally grasp this, once they got some of the logic, it was really, really powerful for them. It allowed them to explain their intervention, defend it, and everything else. Because it wasn't for lack of intelligence or anything else. It was getting round the language, which is so impenetrable for lots of this, getting some of the logic, and largely building confidence that we can, we can all think critically, and more perspectives often the better, because different perspectives offer us different lenses on whether or not you're right or not, I think.
That's great.
Yeah, I really appreciate that last point, Tom. I think the impenetrable language and often the discussions around the professionalization of evaluation and all of the kind of barriers that we put up with our specialized methods, etc., often lead to forgetting that it is actually about critical thinking, which, as you point out, many people are very good at. And in fact, there are some evaluators who aren't particularly good at it. So there's sort of, on the one hand, understanding deeply the methods, and I think Mel's point about actually using them, practicing them in order to really understand the nuance, right? It is not evaluation is not a theoretical exercise. Unless you're applying it, you can't really properly understand it. And that's, very clear in the way you can talk about the methods. But then there's the qualities of the evaluator, or indeed those engaged in that inquiry, in that questioning, in that research process. And then I guess the third layer I would point to is the politics, which you did mention, right? So then you've got to navigate the politics of whatever evaluation space you're in, whether you're embedded or you're external or it's ex post or it's learning or it's accountability. All of that has politics around it, no? And often I think we don't talk about evaluation as inherently political. So I think at those kind of three levels, I see the conversation needing to link such that we can actually acknowledge bricolage and we can actually get better at doing it. Yeah, so I don't know, we've only got a few minutes left. So if anybody has a burning question I've not managed to get to in the chat, now's your last chance. No, otherwise, Tom, any last reflections from you?
Comment, perhaps. Is it Richard? Looks like Richard. Hey, Richard.
Hi, Tom. Hi, nice to meet you, Marina. Yeah, I popped a question in there. It was very stimulating, Tom. No surprise there. But my question was really thinking from an outcome harvesting perspective. And if you're using the approach of asking those who are describing their outcomes to rate the importance of, let's say, their intervention in realizing an outcome, have you tried contrasting what you get from that with what you would find from using one of the other approaches, say, you've been talking about in terms of assessing the quality of evidence in terms of the contribution? And if you haven't, how would you like to speculate on how they may or may not compare? When I ask that, I have in mind that when I've tested self-rated importance of contribution with external independent third parties or substantiators, as we call it in outcome harvesting, you can find that the externals actually rate the importance of the intervention's contribution as higher. The intervention, there's often a lot of caution within an intervention. So it's not, while there's this assumption that this is kind of inbuilt bias of self-reported data, it can often be a limiting factor, I'm sure. Be curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I'm not sure I've done it enough to offer a really sort of insightful picture of it. I've done it fairly recently, or something very similar recently. And I think one piece is how teams themselves benchmark outcomes against one another, I think is important, because I found that how recently, for example, a particular team rated one of their outcomes against another outcome. One was clearly a really significant outcome. And they, probably had a very unique connection, and you could find a smoking gun around that. And another team, possibly for political reasons internally, to say we're all the same, we have the same level of outcomes for different intervention areas. They said, well, this was also a highly significant outcome, and we made a significant contribution. So I think some of it is benchmarking horizontally. Actually, is an important step to take. And then I would only really do something like process tracing for the ones that you think are most significant or is agreed to be most significant or whatever. I also think, like, having read your paper recently, the one on dialogue and dissent, I found lots of that quite useful in terms of quality assurance processes. But I also think that some of the the process tracing logic that you get around the standards of evidence can potentially add a layer of checks to that. So I'd done that recently on outcome harvesting as a means of making sure we could tell a team actually in that program, as it turns out, how confident we were that their explanations of contribution sounded reasonable and therefore were worth investigating further. So this was even before they'd actually gathered evidence from substantiators, say, to confirm it. But that would have helped them to say, well, these are the ones we want to substantiate, and this is why, because we're confident enough on this or not. So I think you can, again, with like the theory testing stuff, you can move lots of these around, depending on how confident you need to be and for whom. Who do you need to justify it to? I don't know. I think I probably found normally people do have quite a lot of confirmation bias. But there are other people in teams, the same teams, who will be incredibly critical and, as you say, will be like even more hard on themselves than external actors. I think it rather depends. But again, that's a question of who do you pick to be a substantiator, or what vantage point do they offer? But similarly, like I've struggled with how to find the perfect substantiator. Who is the right person who both knows your intervention, but that isn't so wrapped up in it that they're going to sort of confirm what you want to hear anyway. And that's tricky and political. But thinking through probative value is one way to think about why is it that I should get this person as a substantiator or not, and what kind of vantage point are they going to offer, which will help me or not to confirm or disconfirm the outcome statement that the team has identified, rated, and suggested, I think.
Fantastic, thanks so much. Yeah, the probative value of the perfect substantiator. I think that should perhaps be the next blog.
Well, Rich, we need to write that together because I don't know the answer to that one. Absolutely,
happy to. Right, well, we're running out of time, so just thank you so much, Tom. That was really, really insightful. There are a few more questions and comments in the chat. I apologize to those whom we didn't get to, but I'm sure Tom would be very happy to have follow-up conversations with those interested. So we'll be putting the recording on our website. There's been a couple of requests also, Tom, for the reference list, etc. So I can follow up with you. And
in the presentation, there's a reference list. So if I send you that again, you can share
that with everyone. Great. Well, thank you again, and thanks everybody, especially the 25 or so of you who are still online. Yeah, and look forward to the next conversation and definitely the next blog, Tom.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for listening. Really appreciate it. Hope it was as interesting for you as it was for me.
Great.
Take care, everyone.